Afternoon, colleagues, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for our In Conversation with series. Some of you may remember it. It kind of started during the time of COVID when I would host particular discussions over and above what was going in our regular webinars, just so that we could tackle particular topics in an ad hoc kind of way. And today our topic for discussion is on science, leadership, and ethics in times of geopolitical crises. There's a lot going on in the global sphere at the moment, and it touches our lives in many ways. The intersectionality is quite complex. And I'm very, very grateful to our colleagues, Professor Janssen, Professor Crane Soodyall, and Professor Kemantri Mudli, who after talking with her briefly today, I convinced her to be part of our discussions today. So, colleagues, also this month is our Freedom Day celebration. We celebrate this since our first official democratic voting on 27th April 1994. So we celebrate Freedom Month in understanding where we've come from, where we are, and where we're going. And I think in the spirit of that theme, today's discussion on science, leadership, and ethics in times of geopolitical crises is well positioned for us to hear from our colleagues who are all ASSAf members and distinguished academics in their own right. So I'm not going to go into the details, but you all know Professor Janssen, a former president of the ASSAf Council, who is currently a distinguished professor of education at Stellenbosch University and has many accolades under his belt. Professor Crane Soodyall is emeritus professor in education and African studies at the University of Cape Town. Also served at the HSRC and plays a sterling role within the Academy, assisting us with the Humanities Book Award. Kemantri Mudli, former at Stellenbosch University and now supposedly retired, but the likes of her cannot really retire, and she's still actively involved in various spheres of ethics, also an ASSAf member, and has represented ASSAf at many fora. So colleagues, I do not want to steal the thunder from these esteemed colleagues. So the format of today is I will allow each of our panelists to say a few words around the topic. Then I will pose a few questions to them. And subsequent to that, we will allow you to join in the conversation by asking questions. When we open that session up, just put up your hand and one of my colleagues assisting would allow you to speak. In the meantime, please use the Q&A if that's open, which it is, I think, to post your questions, which we will address shortly. So welcome to all our colleagues who are online as well. We realize that this is a critical time close to public holidays and you all have many things to do. So welcome and thank you for joining us. So I will start off with Professor Janssen. Jonathan, if you just want to share your thoughts on the topic, and then I'll go to Prof Soodyall and then Professor Mudli in that order. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Himla. And I think the topic is so incredibly important in these times, science, ethics, and leadership in times of geopolitical crisis. And so hats off to the Academy for putting this on the table. Now, first of all, I do believe that the academic world finds itself in a moment of great crisis, and one that is made very visible by developments in the current US administration. But while that crisis might be unfolding with great drama every day in the USA, it has immediate and far-reaching implications for countries around the world, including South Africa. Now, this crisis has particularly serious effects on higher education, and in particular on science, scientists, and scientific work. While the most severe impact has been on the defunding of the health sciences, and in particular on HIV/AIDS research, development, and treatments, PEPFAR being a case in point, I do want to draw attention to other less visible but equally devastating effects of this transatlantic assault on science. And some of the ideas that I will share with you now emerges from conversations I've been having with my friend and colleague at UCT, John Higgins, Professor John Higgins, and we have also made a submission in this regard to the Academic Council. The first threat is to academic freedom, the right of scholars and scientists to pursue their work without being threatened by the government, the right to hire academics, to admit students, to decide on curricular content, and to hold an independent view. Now, in the US, as you know, some countries, universities have caved, like Columbia, when it came under threat of losing $400 million in federal funding, while others very recently, like Harvard and Princeton, pushed back hard. The immediate response of their government was to say, okay, we're going to freeze $2.2 billion due to you, and by the way, we're going to threaten your tax status. This is unheard of in the democratic world, and yet it is happening in real time. When any government deports students or scholars, or for that matter, tourists, because they have a view, then we are all in trouble. I remind you of the words of Martin Luther King Jr., that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And nowhere is this more true than in the case of the academic world. My point is, we certainly are not immune to these threats on our campuses. I was disinvited, by the way, 3 times in the past 2 years from UCT, UKZN, and UNISA. Not a single academic that I know of spoke up against this unbelievable behavior by 3 vice chancellors. It's not about me. It is about the very real threat on the part of supposedly democratic institutions to go exactly the same way. You didn't hear from USAM, you heard from nobody, okay? And trust me, as Columbia now finds out, if you start with one, you come for others. And this is, of course, as a country only recently emerged from authoritarian rule and racist authoritarian rule, this is still very much an issue, academic freedom in South Africa. The second threat, of course, is to the exchange of academics and students, and with that, the exchange of ideas. Much of what South Africa has achieved in science and scholarship is because of the free flow of our best minds across borders. South Africa truly punched above its weight during the COVID crisis. But those partnerships and infrastructures were built over decades by experts in both countries in the field of infectious diseases. But as we see the capitulation of many leading universities under the threat of government, requires us to ask deeper questions about how we got here in the first place. Put differently, what made universities so susceptible, so vulnerable to external threat in these geopolitical times? And I wish to argue that this caving in did not happen overnight, and that what happens right now in the USA is a cautionary tale for South African universities. And it happened, I would argue, because of the ways in which major universities became beholden to money, not just millions, but billions of dollars, which meant that they could be manipulated, cajoled, threatened, and even shut down by a government threatening to withdraw, in that case, federal funds. Few of these universities, it's important to note, made arguments about the nature of the university, its autonomy and independence, its special mission, and its contribution to science and society. Those core values of the academy mattered little when what was at stake was the loss of money, that for a long time, let's be honest, including South Africa, had become the bottom line of both private and public universities right here at home. We talk far too glibly about the neoliberal university and the new public management as slogans. What we need to do is some serious unpacking of what this means and its consequences for university when political authority tries to stamp its impression on South African higher education institutions. Far-fetched? I tell you now, if I could get money together and a PhD student, I would unleash them on all the minutes of the Portfolio Committee on Higher Education since 1994. And you would be amazed at what our politicians think about South African universities. In fact, I have no doubt that if the Portfolio Committee was unleashed on universities, we would see exactly the same pressures on all of us in the name of transformation, which on the other side of the Atlantic is done in the name of anti-Semitism. Not enough is being done is something you would hear often. But those who are alert to the politics of higher education would recognize, of course, that whether it's anti-Semitism or transformation, both issues represent a ruse. It is about authority and control, and that is why this seminar is so important. Thank you, Himla.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for those insightful comments. Colleagues, I forgot to say at the outset that Professor Majosi, our president, unfortunately couldn't join us, and I tender his apologies to the speakers and to everybody, but he will listen to the transcript at the end. And then we had also invited Professor Bani Patiani, who unfortunately, due to some issue that he had to attend to, could not join us. But in any event, I just wanted to put that out. Professor Crane Soodyall, over to you to give us your thoughts on the topic.
So thank you very much, Himla, for asking me to be part of this panel, and thank you, Jonathan, for kicking us off so well. And Jonathan has helped to contextualize where we are, and I want to emphasize only one element of what he spoke to us about, and that's the idea of the university, and particularly its autonomy. So the important thing for us to be dealing with here now is how intensely this idea of the autonomy of the university is under incredible strain at the moment. And that strain places all of us under such pressure that I think we need to be watching what's going on in several institutions, but watching with, I'd like to suggest, please, colleagues, with a kind of sympathetic eye, because the issues are really about survival. But I do want to say that that question of survival always has to be held up against, and I anticipate some of the questions that you would put to us in trying to get us to prepare for all of this, Himla, in anticipation of what the moral good is. So while we need to be sympathetic to the pressures of having to lead an institution now, we also have to emphasize in this idea of what the university is all about and what autonomy is for, and to be remembering always that that autonomy is in the interests of what the greater moral good is all about. Now, this is an old idea. It's an idea which um, um, is brought to a climax in some ways in 1854, and many people who've heard me speak about this will anticipate what I'm going to say, with the establishment of University College in Dublin by Cardinal Newman, 1854. And he makes this incredible statement in talking about the university, that a university has to be a place for people from all quarters, with all kinds of knowledge. I paraphrase him badly, but I mean, that's the substance of what this is all about. And it's essentially, when you come to think about it, it's essentially about the preservation and the protection of borderlessness, of openness, of a kind of capaciousness to ideas which always are going to provoke and push you. And this is under strain right now. It's under strain with the objective in the US, it's against wokeness. In many other places elsewhere in the world, and it's not just in the US, in many other places, you know, particularly I want to come to this thing of neoliberalism. It is about what particularly donor funding is pushing institutions towards, to prioritize in ways which are in the interests of whatever the donor as business, you know, might be. And in some places, it's around straight political control. And it's, of course, it's at its most intense now, coming in, you know, out of what's going on in the US, but it's a constant in the way in which the universities are constituted. But the crisis, let me just say quickly, and I'll say this very quickly, is not a new thing, is not a new thing at all. We went through this quite intensely during the 1930s, the rise of Nazism. And what that moment in time produced was this incredible paradox, where the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, Heidegger, was actually a Nazi. And how you live with that reality, how he lived with it, how after being appointed to the University of Freiburg in 1934, he continued to be a member of the party. I really can't get my small brain around you know, that reality. And he was a member of the Nazis, the Nazi party, right up until 1945. And what he did in that particular process was subject the idea of the university, this idea of knowledge from all quarters and people from all quarters, you know, to incredible strain. And the global intellectual and scholarly enterprise comes then in the 1950s in the United States with McCarthyism to exactly the inheritance of what Heidegger had come to permit and almost authorize for us during that early 1930s period. And we ourselves, of course, have the apartheid era, which closed down both the physical spaces and the space of the mind in incredible kinds of ways. So we've been here before. And we really have to understand the history of this thing that we call the university, and narrate for ourselves how our institutions were able to get through and over all of that. Because we do move into periods of much greater freedom, of much greater openness. What neoliberalism does is to close down, but even in the presence of neoliberalism, we have incredible opennesses. And the university, in those terms, and we need to understand this, is never a single thing. It's going to have in its leadership, elements that are trying to close down, but there are always going to be people fighting to keep it open. And this is what we are having to think through right now. How do we keep this thing open? How do we get to this idea of the borderless scholarly space, or at least towards the ideal of borderlessness? And that's the danger that we're having to deal with now. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Himla.
Thank you, Crane, for sharing some of those thoughts. There is a question in the Q&A from Professor Kaji related to your issue on neoliberalism, Crane. So if you could look at that and prepare to have a response. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Kemantri Moodley to share some thoughts on the topic. So over to you, Kemantri.
Thank you very much, Himla. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you to Professor Jansen and Professor Soodyall for their insights and for introducing several important concepts around the topic of geopolitical crises that we are currently facing, as well as the challenges that these bring at various levels. So firstly, I'd like to say that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and that everything, about science, in fact, a fundamental principle around science is its independence. And we need to be very concerned when this independence is eroded in any way. And at various levels, in various different parts of the world, independence of science has been seriously impacted. And of course, the important contribution that we make in the course of science to the generation of new knowledge and to impact on society, likewise, is eroded. So at a meta-ethical level, the question that the challenges that we currently face, go back beyond just academic institutions and scientists to questions around the ethics of leadership. And I think that is a current crisis that we face that to a large extent cannot be explained by many of the ethical principles in leadership or many of the theories that we subscribe to when it comes to ethics in general. I think we face many conflicts in terms of idealism versus pragmatism. And, ethicists are often accused of being idealists and not in touch with the real world and the practical challenges that arise. And so at many levels, we speak about morality, which refers to what is actually happening in the world, and then we speak about ethics. And ethics is always framed in an ought to language. What ought we to do? What is the best way to manage these conflicts and these crises? And we try really hard using various frameworks, various principles and theories. And somehow it's often very difficult to justify the harm that is occurring in the context of these geopolitical crises around the world. Often as bioethicists, we start to question ourselves in terms of the value that ethics is adding to these various crises and challenges around the world. From a health sciences perspective, I think the principle of first do no harm is always upmost in our conversations. And the current funding crises that have impacted health sciences particularly, as Professor Jansen has mentioned in his opening address, impact to a large extent on healthcare as well as research. The entire discipline of research ethics, has been built around ensuring that both animal and human participants in research are not harmed. And yet we find ourselves in the current situation experiencing, the opposite of what we have always proposed and supported in terms of ethics. Obtaining consent from participants in research is critical to the entire scientific endeavor. And yet, in many clinical trials that have been interrupted as a result of the funding crisis, we have to backtrack almost. How do we explain to participants who consented to particular research participation? How do we even explain to participants why it is that a clinical trial is interrupted for funding reasons alone? How do we explain interruption of treatment when we know that people have a right of access to healthcare, and where children are concerned, a right to healthcare? So along with all the violations in terms of ethics principles and theories, I think if we look at a human rights framework, these are some of the important impacts that the geopolitical crises of our day have had in terms of research. And of course, how do we communicate to the public the impact of these crises at a time when trust in science is at an all-time low? So these ethical violations that are occurring as a direct result of science being interrupted, funding for science being interrupted, makes it even more difficult to build trust in communities where science is concerned and where public engagement is important. And I think finally, we can look at the ethics of responsibility at various levels. We've already heard about this overdependence on external funding. And we then have to look to our own governments and to our own funding mechanisms and consider what percentage of our gross domestic product is even spent on research. And if we are constantly going to be dependent on external sources of funding, and if our own national authorities are not going to be able to fund research adequately, then we're in trouble, because this dependence on external sources of funding compromises us in many ways. It compromises the type of research that we do, whose agenda are we following when we are this dependent on external funding, and to what extent are governments able to fill in the gaps where both healthcare and research are impacted in the way they are currently. We know that many HIV treatment programs have been interrupted. There too, what is the responsibility of government in terms of ensuring that there is a basic level of healthcare provided, and that specific programs that have been running for decades in South Africa continue to be funded, and that patients or the general public who are dependent on these programs are not left without treatment, because that then takes us right back to the principle of do no harm. So this, the non-maleficence requirement in ethics is quite strong where treatment and research are concerned. So having made some of those introductory comments, I'm going to stop, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mantri, for putting those views into perspective. Okay, colleagues, I've got a few questions prepared for each of the panelists. But in the meantime, can you also, now having heard each person, voice their thoughts on the topic, can you share some of your questions in the Q&A? And also, if you know specifically who you want to address it to, you could indicate that in your question as well. And if there's anybody who would like to speak, just put your hand up, and my colleagues assisting will patch you into the discussion. Well, thanks again to all for actually coming at the topic from various perspectives and giving us a kind of overview on the issues at hand. Obviously, there are many, many more, but let's hope that we could cover a few more. Colleagues, the one thing that comes through quite strongly when you listen to talks from representatives of the department and government, etc., is the issue on diplomacy. And the question I have is, how can we manage, or who should be managing this whole thing on science diplomacy during geopolitical crises and tensions, as we've heard? Sometimes the voice of academics need to be viewed. Who should be doing it, and how should we do it in ways that speak to the issues like you've all been addressing today, but at the same time create it in a way that raises the issue without being, in your face kind of thing. So the question is, how should we manage from an academic perspective the diplomacy in science? And the second part of the question is, how should our governments be doing this, given what you've aired already in your preambles? How should our government be responding to some of the tensions that exist? So Jonathan, I'll start with you to hear your thoughts on this issue.
It's a great question, actually, but also a difficult one. So I think at the intergovernmental level, it is, and we just took South Africa and the USA as a case in point. It's very, very difficult at the moment, even more difficult in the wake of the, Ambassador Rasool's firing, really, or expulsion, sorry, from Washington. So you can imagine there's no particular appetite on the part of the US administration on a whole lot of other things that in our government's thinking are much more important than science. I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying when you're trying to make sure that we don't lose the trade deals that are so important to lives and livelihood, then of course science takes a back seat. But even so, I do think the political environment is toxic at the moment to intergovernmental resolutions. What I do think, if we took science diplomacy more broadly, I think we should open up that possibility for diplomacy to other associations, to professional associations. I've been very impressed, by the way, by the American Association of University Professors, who have actually opened up a space in which we can talk about other ways, outside of government perhaps, in which we can ensure, for example, that there's an ongoing exchange of scholars, of scientists, of young people, across borders. I really like Crane's reference here to Cardinal Newman, the preservation of borderlessness. I don't think that's entirely dependent, on government and so on. So I think we should look at other ways. And then finally, I do think we should look at our own government. We don't have a fight with our government at the moment anyway, with respect to science. And the document that we sent to you, Himla, we made to our government and sort of say, what can you do? Okay, I take Hussein Solomon's point in the chat. We basically have a bankrupt state, and where investment in science in R&D is already very low as percentage of GDP. I mean, it's not like, there's a lot of money floating around, but I do think we have the responsibility to engage our own government and say, now, what are you going to do, okay, with respect to the science community in South Africa?
Thanks, Jonathan. I see Professor Michael Khan has been patched into the panel. So I'll allow him to speak now, and then I will pursue my remainder questions to the panel. Professor Khan?
Thank you. Can you hear me, Himla?
Yes, we can.
It's very kind of you to put me in so early in the conversation. I didn't expect that, and I'm prepared to wait a little while if you wish.
That's okay.
Since I have the attention of this wonderful audience a few points. The first one, which may be disputed, is to recognize the very important role, and I will not refer to the Academy, I'd rather refer to the Republic of Science, played during the HIV/AIDS early years in challenging the orthodoxy of the top level of government and getting on with the work. And that, as has already been pointed out, laid the foundation for the country capacity in clinical trials, infectious diseases, genomics, and so on. And I really feel one has to recognize the leadership of the time. And in many ways, Malekapuru Makhoba was out there on behalf of the Republic of Science. Thank you very much. Something has been said already, both by Jonathan and also by Professor Moodley, on funding and expenditure. So I'd like to just share something with the room that I looked up yesterday, and it is to do with agenda setting and choice at the very top of the government department responsible, the DST. So I could do it as a Trivial Pursuit game, but I won't. I'll just give you the numbers. Over the last 2 decades, we have committed 4.5 billion rand to radio astronomy and telescopes. And of course, it's very exciting stuff. It's extremely difficult to demonstrate social impact, but it captures the imagination, and it's a wonderful thing in and of itself. In the same period of 2 decades, the government expenditure, or the national expenditure on vaccine development, remember it's 4.5 billion on telescopes, on vaccines, 100 million. Okay, so think about that. When our political heads say, oh, we're going to develop our own vaccine for the next pandemic, whatever shape it comes in, it's really a pipe dream because we have not got the critical mass. So that's the first point about numbers. The second, picking up on Jonathan mentioning low R&D expenditure, it's fallen from nearly 1%, it didn't quite even make it, of GDP in 2005-06, down to 0.61, and it's not going to pick up very rapidly unless you have more people in the system. That's key. Now is the time, in fact, to offer immediate residency to those people who've lost their jobs in the US. But I want to go in the last moment to something much more critical. It turns out 25% of our national R&D expenditure is on health sciences. And taken at face value, one might say that's fabulous, that's fantastic. As health sciences people are addressing health needs, social needs. Isn't it great? There's a big problem that's already been in the room. Something like 70% of that expenditure is on clinical trials. Whether these are initiated through NIH or Glaxo Wellcome, it doesn't matter. The point is, what's being tested is a pharmaceutical product whose IP is already registered elsewhere, and it will never generate IP here. So one has to look at the clinical trial industry in a very, very critical way now and ask the hard question, what should we be substituting because the funding has dried up, and what can we do without? I could go on the whole day, but that would be absurd. So thank you for the time.
Thanks, Michael, for sharing those points. I think you raised quite a number of issues in those two points about funding, etc. Does anybody from the panel wish to respond to that? Crane, I see you're not. Go ahead.
So I'm not going to respond to Michael, but I want to finish the conversation that Jonathan began, please, Himla. Can I go?
Yes, please go ahead.
No, it's really about understanding who we are in thinking about diplomacy. And it's really important to understand the nature of this community in which we find ourselves. And the specificity of this nature makes us as a community very different, if you like, to the community of national politics and international politics. And so solidarity and connectedness in the Republic of Knowledge, to use Michael Kahn's terms there, connectedness works with, I'd like to think, a whole different ethics, a whole different set of obligations, responsibilities, entitlements. You know, our citizenship of this Republic of Knowledge requires us to behave in very different kinds of ways to the ways in which we would in circumstances of raw power. And what that in some ways means is that we are required to be in relationships of brotherhood and sisterhood, and whatever you like, with people who are in our fields, but who are engaged in this question of trying to solve the problems of what the world are. And that demands a sensibility which goes beyond boundaries such as nation, if you like. And what this requires is that each of us needs to be thinking in diplomatic terms. Each of us, wherever we might be, has an obligation to be reaching out to our sisters, our brothers, who are working in the spaces that we might be thinking about, and to be making connections. I mean, our young scholars here in South Africa are anxious about reaching out to people elsewhere. But if they know that somebody is working in a particular field, in some ways it's almost an obligation on their part to say to this person, I'm really interested in what you're doing. Please, can you help me? Or please, can I be in a conversation with you? And that's really crucial. But just for the moment, in the situation in which we find ourselves, the point that Jonathan makes now about these associations, the associations don't have the vulnerabilities of the institutions. And so we must look to them to be making the lead, playing leadership roles in this context. They must be literally now stepping up almost everywhere and reaching out to each other and convening these forums like this. I mean, we must from here begin to do that without any sense of hubris, any sense of anxiety of overreach. We simply are fulfilling our obligations, I'd like to suggest, of our membership of this community of which we are a part. Thank you.
Thank you, Crane, for elaborating on the issue of diplomacy and why it is that we should be thinking around that line as we engage going forward. Does anybody want to offer a kind of response to some of the issues that Michael Kahn raised? Kimantri, what do you think about the way in which our allocated budgets go for one type of research, which we get sold on being of value, even though you may not see the immediate needs, because it contributes in many other ways to something that is more targeted to biomedical and health?
So Himla, I think it's always been a concern in terms of our government spend on research. It's difficult to, always prioritize health over other disciplines. And so one wants to work towards a balance. But I think some important points have been raised in that we have many health crises that need to be addressed. I think to start off with, we need a public health care provision that meets the needs of our societies. And given the large number of unemployed healthcare professionals currently, even spend on providing treatment programs in public health in general are way below what they should be. So we've fallen behind in terms of meeting our constitutional right to health and right to access to health in the country. So we've already, got a huge deficit where that is concerned. In terms of research expenditure, we're way below what we should be. And in terms of pharmaceutical trials, which was another point that was raised, I think to a large extent, there has been significant controversy around the type of interventions that are tested in clinical trial research. And here it's the regulatory authorities that also need to play a bigger role. This includes SAPRA, it includes all the research ethics committees that approve research in the country in terms of looking at what is the burden of disease in the country? What are our health priorities? And are we addressing those health priorities with the type of clinical trials that we are doing? If we're testing a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, and we're testing the 50th such drug that is on the market, or possibly going to make it to market, what value is that adding to the health needs of our local populations? And of course, it brings up many issues in terms of what is relevant research, what is going to be of value to our populations. And often those are the important ethical questions that we need to address right at the get-go of the regulatory process. And likewise, researchers also need to think in terms of the type of research that they are conducting and its relevance. So many, important ethical issues that fall into place where clinical trial research is concerned.
Thanks very much. The other question that I have to the panel is about the role of leadership during a time of crisis. So how can leaders, both in academic environments and decisional policymakers, balance, taking a lead on particular issues like we have now versus the importance of evidence-based decision making in order to kind of have rapid responses? What should some of the elements or criteria be considered when making these decisions? Because the public wants to hear the voice of leaders and policymakers in such crises and times of crises. And so what sort of parameters should guide how leaders respond? And should it be a long drawn out consultative process? Should it be a rapid fire type thing? And to what extent having the evidence to substantiate it come into play? And as you consider that question, also consider, has South Africa been represented well in some of the executive orders from the Trump administration when responding to our land issues and the plight of Afrikaner communities and farmers, etc. So I'm just trying to get a sense of, people make decisions on information that may not be, checked and proofed and evidence-based, and yet it creates such a dynamic shift, global shifts, as we see it playing out now. So what is the role of leaders, both from academia and in the political fray, in terms of how we put out these sound bites of information going on? So just share some of your thoughts. And I'll start again with Jonathan on this issue.
Thank you, Himla. So first of all, I thought that Kay made a very, very important point, is that what this crisis throws up is questions of ethics in leadership, where leaders like the president of Colombia caves in to what is clearly an overreach on the part of an authoritarian government, everybody suffers, okay? Everybody suffers. And it's partly because of a misreading of serious misreading. I still think every university vice chancellor, whether it's in South Africa or elsewhere, must get at least one module of training in politics. Because if you think that an authoritarian government is going to stop, at 400 million, then you don't understand how authoritarian rule regimes work. Okay, so so it raises the issue, as Kay said, about the ethics of leadership. Okay, where was the leadership until Harvard's president said we will not be told by government, okay, as a private university, what to do with respect to teaching and learning and all of that stuff. Okay, the mistake he makes is to think it's only a private university concern. There's also a public university concern. And so I look to leadership, people look to leadership. And again, sticking with Kay's point, we have a responsibility, both the academy, but also the science community in general. And I'm going to quote from what she said, in explaining ourselves to the public. I thought that was a beautiful. We've got to explain ourselves to the public. The public will only support us to the extent that they understand why it is important to have universities, why it is important to have research, why it is important to protect your scholarly community. If the public doesn't understand that, they will tend, and this is, by the way, I think is what happened in the US, sadly, is I don't think the elite universities explain themselves to the public or sympathy, etc. Crane's point, however, is also true. Both Crane and I worked in university leadership. It is very, very difficult to make that decision as principle and pragmatism. I get that, right? He's right. Still, at the end of the day, this is all we have. All we have, universities, and as Michael so beautifully put it, the reason the money went into telescopes and radio astronomy is simply because government decided that's where the money is going to go. Right? So it's not like there is no way, right? It is where are the pressure points to make sure that government puts this in areas of greatest need, as much as I love blue sky research and all of that stuff. So how do we get out of this whole limit? There's the question that I think people like Christian Perk and others have posed in the chat. Did you get it? We tend to think of the West as the USA, right? But the West is much more, a much broader concept, okay? And so if I may use an example from from the beef industry, of all things, is that when China decided this week to no longer take beef, from the US, which sadly is going to be devastating for farmers, particularly in the Midwest, right? Devastating. They went to Australia and struck a deal. I think we need to be much more agile in the science community and say, where else can we go in these times? Maybe things change in 2028, but right now, where do we go to establish, renew, revitalize, expand scientific relationships, scholarly exchanges, and so on, elsewhere in the world, not just the West, but elsewhere in the world. And I think that is instead of just sitting and having this one idea of an old axis, research. And then Michael said something in passing, which I actually would like to put on the table. The way American universities became really leading universities in the world, particularly after the Second World War, was when scientists fled oppression during the period of National Socialism in Germany, but also in other parts of Europe. That's where all the Nobel laureates came from, in the main, right? I think South Africa must open our borders and say, where people live, create hospitable conditions so that we can host some, as we do in some universities, some of the leading scientists in the world, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I'm trying to think of ways other than simply sticking with the old model, which clearly is being collapsed at the moment.
Thanks. Crane, do you want to add anything to that points I've put to you?
No, exactly. No, I want to just stay with what Jonathan's, putting in front of us, because it compounds the idea of opening ourselves up right now. Is opening us up more than we do. We have, in some of our institutions, we have something like 30% of our staff who come from outside of the country's borders. And that's quite an incredible contribution, which is currently being made in the country. The institution from which I come has something like 25% of its staff, and it's always and it's something that we have to kind of come to appreciate. It's always an invigorating thing. People coming from experiences that you don't have. It takes us back to this framework for thinking about the institution that Cardinal Newman, put in our heads in the middle of the 1800s. But that thing bumps up against the idea of the nation state and all of the limitations which come with that, which you can't be dismissive of. So we are now having to think about, in the country, about growing our own timber. So we've got to think of ways of bringing those two things together now in the most opportune kind of way, not giving up on this idea of openness, but also thinking about how this openness invigorates the local. And it's just such an incredible thing when it happens. And we're seeing it in the country at the moment now with these young new professors emerging all over. You've been a little bit part of that, Himla. There's these future professors, and they are incredible. They're incredible because they've had the benefit of engagement, from elsewhere. So we've got to behave differently to the way in which the idea of who we are as people is constituted in formal politics. We've got to behave differently. We've got to offer a model which is different. And it rubs up against current realities, but we've got to try and think of our ways creatively through that. And this is absolutely now essential, for the moment. We've got to get that talking, so that the principal, the VC of our universities must be talking to presidents in the United States, asking how they can be cooperating, how they can be collaborating, what new ways of supporting each other, might be possible, and that might get us out of these difficulties, and it's a practical way in which, to be thinking about the next short term. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. I see Professor Yunus Balam has been put onto the panel. Professor Balam, welcome. Lovely to see you, or see you on the chat. You could go ahead and make your comment or ask your question.
Thank you very much, Himla, and thank you for the fascinating conversation. And really, the three panelists have been very insightful. I wanted to pose a question a little bit differently, and that is, how should intellectuals respond in times of this kind of global crises? As Crane says, it's not new. Humanity's visited these situations before. In times when the levers of power end up in the hands of crackpots, when decisions about truth and untruth are made in a trigger finger. These are not new for us. The question is, how should and do intellectuals respond in times like these? Of course, there's been a lot of writing. Julian Bender, Hannah Arendt has written on this, and as Crane says, the intellectuals are not only the ones who are at universities. Whoever thought that Wagner would go out in support of Aryan race theory, etc. The response of intellectuals, of course, is sometimes exile. Edward Said is an example. We've quoted the movement of intellectuals from Europe to America and the benefit of that. We're starting to see that in the US now. I mean, senior academics have reportedly are moving to Canada. I'm sure other countries are wooing them as much as we would like to. But I think we need to be careful about sort of characterizing the situation as the university under siege. We do speak to our community. And of course, the other point we forget is also we often speak on behalf of our publics. And I don't think in South Africa we've always done that. We're doing that very well at the moment. I think Jonathan has pointed to the fact that universities are not sort of pulling their weight in, and particularly university leaders. I'm concerned about the context, or the South African context. Firstly, we've also come from a time when those in power spoke about the problem of the clever blacks. So the idea of intellectuals as dangerous is not new to us. And that attitude, posture, has not gone away. The place of intellectuals in society has been a subject for long conversation, going back to Lenin and Krupskaya. And of course, the Cambodians, Pol Pot regime found a particularly brutal answer to that question. We, on the other hand, are finding that culturally, popular culture recognizes intellectuals as enemies of the state. And it's becoming increasing. For our part, I don't think that we've done very well within the university. I'm shocked at how muted senates have become at universities, despite the fact that we have an act that gives Senate unbelievable power in terms of custodial role of the academic and intellectual project. They've really been emasculated in many ways. Apologies for the gendered term. But the way in which, I mean, the corruption, of course, doesn't help. Bad leadership doesn't help. Academic institutions under administration does not help. I'm arguing that we make a bad case for ourselves in the public, and that as intellectuals and academics, we need to think very carefully again about how we speak on behalf of our public. The last point I wanted to make is I mean, I've been tilting my lancet and tiring horses at this wall, and it doesn't seem to crumble. And this imaginary divide between the sciences and humanities. And yes, of course, there's lots of writing and lots of talk about the need for scientists to understand the social sciences, etc. But I'm equally worried about the extent to which our humanities graduates are completely illiterate about the sciences and are so willing to hand their futures over to technocrats when they go out into society. And I think it's a subject that we need to have internal conversation about, and perhaps think about the way in which we exercise our responsibility as the intellectuals that are meant to speak on behalf of society. Thank you for allowing me to talk.
Thanks, Professor Bellum. We'll take your last point perhaps into another webinar discussion, because we're constantly faced with that. But could anyone on the panel respond to how should intellectuals respond during times of crisis, as outlined by Professor Bellum? Who would like to field this one?
Let me just say this very quickly. Hi, Eunice. The issue is just not, it's too simplistic to say humanities graduates are illiterate about the sciences. I think all our graduates are illiterate about the broader world. Our science graduates don't know the humanities. They can't read complex social, and so it goes both ways. And this has to do fundamentally with the way we train our students. We make them urban planners and immunologists on day one when they are not yet educated. They are trained. They are not yet educated, and that's why they can't. A student in sociology seldom has a intelligible conversation about economics or about, COVID or anything like that. And that makes us very susceptible to what Kay described as an environment in which science and scientific truth is very much up for grabs. The point Yunus makes is absolutely correct. I mean, can you imagine, just given the state of the world right now, I haven't heard a single, correct me if I'm wrong, colleagues, I haven't heard a single university vice chancellor get on a public platform and make the case for the university in the context of this crisis. Not a single one. Complain, yes. Complain about the lack of funding, complain about the cutoff of, AIDS funding and so on and so forth. But where's the eloquent intellectual vice chancellor that gets up, and makes the case for funding with our partners here and abroad? I honestly don't know why ASSAf exists. I really don't. Okay. Because you would have expected that this body that represents all the vice chancellors would make a public statement. Crane and I belong to one of the largest educational research organization in the world. They're just taking their government to court right now, right? The ARA, on the basis of the threat to closure of what they call the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education. I don't see that kind of consciousness, okay? We wait for students to protest before we all panic, instead of waiting for our leaders, back to Kane, to take an ethical position, a political position, and says, this is where we stand, okay? Anybody who still thinks you can think about the university today as a nationalist possession is not paying attention to the way in which the world has changed around us.
Thanks. Colleagues, we're kind of going short on time, but Professor John Higgins has given some insightful comments in the chat. So please read that. In the meantime, I'd like to invite Faye Regan to go ahead and pose your question or add your comment. Faye, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Himla, and thank you to your panel. So my question is twofold. The first is, in terms of global inequalities and scientific access, we do find ourselves with a lot of geopolitical competition. And some of that is, examples of that is the China tech rivalry, vaccine nationalism, etc. How does that exacerbate global inequalities in access to knowledge and resources? And then the second part of my question is, and it's perhaps it's a question to Jonathan, because he spoke of historic precedents for the current siege on science. What do you think, Jonathan, are the lessons we can learn? Are there lessons that we can take away from those periods in our history? And also, what are the structural changes needed to insulate science from geopolitics? Thanks.
Thanks, Faye. Jonathan, would you like to respond to the question Faye's raised to you directly?
Not to the second one, because that was Crane. Crane spoke on historical precedents, that affect. So maybe if Crane could do that one, I'd like to perhaps say something about
the first one. Go ahead, since you have the floor.
Well, I do think this is a real issue. But the amazing thing for me about science and scientific competition is that if you look at inter-university relationships, or even science councils and universities, or they're able to do two things at the same time. They're able to cooperate and they're able to compete. And again, the relationship, if I have time one day, I really would love to write this up as a case study. If you just look at the long-term relationship between Slim Karim and Anthony Fauci, of course, they're doing competitive science, right, in infectious diseases over decades. And yet when the crisis hit, they learned from each other. They spoke to each other. So the notion that science is only a cutthroat business in which everybody is rushing for the Nobel I don't think it's the reality about how science is practiced. I think there is an enormous sense of not just that we need each other, but also of the complementarity of skills and of experiences that people bring into the pot So I think these things actually tend to, even in the social sciences, tend to coexist, the cooperation, the competition. And I think that's good, because in doing my particular scholarship, I want to be the best in what I do. But I'd be stupid to think that I can achieve that without an open dialogue conversation with my colleagues in other parts of the world.
Thank you, Jonathan. Crane, do you want to respond to the second part?
Yes, thanks. So we can never write guarantees into anything that we do. So we can't permanently insulate the university from the influences, from the effects, from what's happening in the wider ecology in which it is set. And it's really important in terms of that, while the university is a very special place, never to accord to it the final say on anything. It's really crucial that we think of the university as contributing to, if you like, expanding the horizons and pushing the horizons of what we know around anything, but never to have the final word. And that's the struggle in which the universities are always going to be placed. And so they have an onus, therefore, as Kay said, to explain themselves. They are required always to be available, open to the public, open to a broader dialogue, discourse about what is going on. If they don't do that, knowledges which have other interests are always going to seek to, in some ways, determine what our understanding of issues should be, as is happening in many countries at the moment. In many countries at the moment, even the most, if you like, scientifically advanced countries have difficulties with keeping these other forms of knowledge, which are often bad forms of knowledge, in a state of, if you like, engagement. And so the suspicion that we see around the universities at the moment is partly our own fault. We have to be opening ourselves up. And so it's a real pity, that we have gotten to this point where our universities are closed. They're physically closed. The university at which I kind of come to understand the University of the Witwatersrand, you have to go use biometrics to be able to get into the place there, and the space develops its own kind of sacralization, and it's really problematic. And of course, there are reasons for that, which we have to be sensitive to. But we have to find ways of engaging so that, and I'm going to use this expression, and it's, I know it's susceptible to comment, so that what we might call better reason is always available. Always available for discourse. And it's in any field, any field. It's not just the humanities, it's in science, and the sciences aren't infallible. The sciences themselves are very susceptible to all kinds of biases and problems. But we have to open up the space, and it's as much an obligation of ourselves to be inviting, to be hospitable, to be making allowance for difference, for dealing with difference in radical kinds of ways. Now, you are talking here and thinking about it in utopian terms, and you might get into trouble for the ways in which you kind of manage this, but we've got to think about openness as a way to be going into the future. The availability of particularly now with these new scientific modalities. Anybody can learn anything. Anybody can. And you don't need to come to the university to be able to understand quantum physics, which is incredible. You don't need to go to university. You can do it by yourself.
Yeah.
But at the university, you're helped, and so the university must extend that obligation of helping, in a much broader sense, but also to not think of itself as pronouncing the final word on anything. Thanks.
Thanks, Prain. Prof. Himla Soodyall, how should we, as academics and intellectuals, contribute to a dialogue with the public, to inform public, and also to speak on behalf of the public?
So Himla, I think the way we engage with the public has always been suboptimal. I think more and more, universities are always accused of being ivory towers, and I think that has not changed, and we have not significantly engaged with the public on many aspects of intellectual pursuits, whether it is science or the social sciences or any other discipline. We often publish in scientific journals, but we rarely write for the lay public, write in community newspapers, etc., and engage with the media. So I think science communication needs a lot more work. I don't think that we can insulate science from geopolitics. And here we need to move more towards systems thinking. Our education system is flawed from the get-go. And we all work in silos, and we think that this is just an artificial separation of different aspects of how we live in the world as humans. It's just not possible to put knowledge into concrete, discrete spaces. There is this interdependence, and systems thinking is absolutely important. We all impact on each other in various ways. I think to think that HIV as a disease could only be something impacting on one part of the world is flawed thinking. It's part of systems thinking to understand how things are interdependent and how different aspects of science interact with each other and impact on each other. So I think it's all about broadening, how we educate, and starting at an early level. As Jonathan, I'm sure, will also agree, that we need to re-examine our education system from the beginning to all the way through to tertiary types of education. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a very nice way to kind of bring this exciting discussion to a close. I mean, we could go on forever, and I'm actually saddened that I didn't get to ask more of the questions that I had planned for, but I welcomed the engagement from our members of the audience, and also for the kind of cross talk from our panelists. So we are very, very grateful to your contribution, because you've definitely demonstrated that in times of geopolitical uncertainty, maintaining scientific integrity and ethical leadership is crucial for fostering trust in science and ensuring its responsible use. Leaders must prioritize transparency, accountability, and inclusivity, while also addressing the potential for the misuse of scientific knowledge and research. So a lot of what we've discussed kind of hovers around my kind of closing sentiments. But of course, I started off by saying that this is Freedom Month, and we also reflect, not just enjoy the public holiday, which we all do, but for us to reflect on where we've come from, and the kind of sacrifices that some of the leaders before have made to ensure that we live in the times that we currently do. But while there's good, there's also the bad and the ugly. And we, as an Academy of Science, and as academics and intellectuals in general, need to lead, as Professor Himla Soodyall has said to us, to have that conversation and to guide wherever we can. So it gives me great pleasure to thank all of you. I know you're all very busy and have meetings, etc., scheduled around today. So thank you very much, Jonathan, Crane, Himantri, for giving us your time for this discussion, and to Michael, Professor Ballam, and Faye, and others on the chat who have been dialoguing as we've been going along. Sorry I couldn't get to everything, but hopefully there's some conversation that you could follow. Thank you to our audience for joining us and sticking with us. I know others have had to leave. And it remains for me to say a very, very big thank you to one and all. Be safe as you travel if you are. And let's try to drive what we've heard today into some positivity as we go forward. Thank you all. Until we meet again, be safe and be good, and all the best. And thank you to my colleagues at ASSAf for doing the background work in hosting it. Take care, and I bring this webinar to a close now. All the best. Bye.